SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, welcome to the course An Introduction to Disability Studies. Lecture number 14 is titled as History of Disability in India. Before I talk about history of disability in India, let's go back and talk what I covered, what I discussed in the previous lectures. So, obviously, I have already covered and analyzed and discussed, debated, engaged with the discourse of aesthetics and disability, and then I touched upon gender, body and sexuality. Let me make a first quick point. What are the important points that I covered, I discussed in gender, body and sexuality? The first thing that I discussed is that why are we talking about gender and sexuality in relation to disability. So, I made this point that as we all know that disability studies is not only meant for people with disabilities, but it also meant for any marginal identity. So, gender discourse is already a marginalized one, it has also not got very much space in academic and civic culture. However, now it has got enough space, but still there is a contestation for making it more inclusive for academicians or for people. But the question why I touched upon gender is because Aristotle, like a people who is a wonderful thinker and was a philosopher, who was a wonderful thinker and philosopher, he also talked about women as a mutilated one. So, you see that female body was considered as a mutilated body. So, which means to say that women were not considered as a proper human, but as if they are less human in comparison to man. And the idea of mutilation simply suggests that the body is not proper. There is something missing with the body. There is something castrated. Therefore, the discourse of women also align with disability. Second point I also made was about sexuality. When I was talking about sexuality, I made a very strong point by saying that homosexual people are also disabled in a sense that they deviate from heteronormative culture. So, any deviation from the norm will be considered as a disabled, as I was strongly making a point that if something has to be disqualified, somehow you prove that it is a disabled, right. And to prove something is a disabled, somehow you have to come to a point where to say that something is deviated from the norm. So, and if something deviates from the norm, it is not acceptable in our society, and which is why it aligns with disability, and then obviously it becomes easier for society to marginalize that identity. All right. So, this is the second important point that I made in the previous lecture called gender, body and sexuality, and obviously I started talking about that how certain forms of body are also disabled, right. Also I talked about diseases and all. So, this is what I touched upon in the previous discourse, that is what I was talking in previous lectures. So, today's lecture is about history of disability in India. As you know, this is a very vast topic. To cover it in one lecture is not easy, it is really difficult, because you are going to talk about disability, history of disability, and that too in India, because India is a very large various country. And again, when I am saying India, it also becomes very difficult for someone to talk any discourse when they know that India is a very diverse country, which means to say that the go to north, go to the south, go to the east, go to the west, come to the central part, they all have a different culture. In fact, the defining feature of India is nothing but diversity, right. So, talking about disability in relation to India is also difficult. Second point is also that you see that there are a lot of discourses have already emerged, a lot of things have already been talked about, issued, debated, discussed, but the point is that covering it up in one lecture is almost impossible. So, what I have done in this lecture is I have just touched upon important points which will pave the way for scholars or students who are listening to me to understand how to think about disability in India, as well as what are the other important points or issues they need to read more by themselves to understand it, right. Because obviously, you know that this lecture which is being recorded for you, which you are going to listen or you are listening right now, they are indicative. They are not in a sense that you listen to this and you can understand everything about it. Obviously, it will help you, it will explain a lot of ideas which is not possible by reading your own self, and that is why I am here to help you out. What is another point is talking about is that when we talk about history, it also important become that which history, whose history I am going to talk and discuss about it, right. Is the history taken from the perspective of the majorities, or is the history that only talk about the Mughal history or ancient history or medieval history or modern history, right, or just couple of days before that has passed, because that has also become part of history, right. So, just explain what I am going to do in this lecture is that I am going to touch upon only important points, obviously covering from the ancient, which means to say what even Vedic literature has to say about disability, right. How people were how people understood what disability is in our society and how they treated people with disabilities. From there, I will be talking to current times. But one thing is important to understand this, that since India is a very diverse, and if you think that this is not applicable what I am saying about a particular region or particular communities. So, I apologize for that, because as you know, as a researcher I have also limitation to talk about an issue which is in itself a very complex and full of intricacies, and at the same time talking about a country which again itself is a very complex and full of intricacies, right. Let us say for example, you remember there is a very interesting book called An Argumentative Indian by Amartya Sen, right. I would suggest you that if you please get time, do read this book by Amartya Sen called An Argumentative Indian. What is talking about that? I am just giving you a background understanding so that you can understand that when you are going to talk about disability in the Indian context, what are the important points that you have to keep in mind. So, the first point is Amartya Sen, as he says, that India is a full of dialogic nature, right. There is a, in culture of India there are dialogues, which means to say that there was a point of time, I am not talking about today, but obviously the kind of society we had, there people used to follow the debates, people used to argue, people used to talk, and I am sure that if you go back and read the ancient history to get admission into Nalanda and Takshashila like important institution, unfortunately they are not today the same kind of, they do not hold the same importance as they used to in ancient times. So, what used to happen in Nalanda and Takshashila? There were not any exams, there were no any exams for someone to get admission into Nalanda and Takshashila universities. What used to happen, the person who was a doorkeeper, he used to talk and engage with the debates with the person who are going to enter into that universities, right. And if he feels you are good enough, then only he would allow you, or he allowed someone to get into that university. So, the point here is that they are not going to check the certificates, they are not going to check whether you have learned this or learned that, they are just going to put a dialogue with you. And if you are engaging with that dialogue and the dialogue is going to be satisfactory, then only you are allowed to get admission. So, the point about is that it is more about the discussion, it is more about differing from one's views, but respecting one's views. That is a That is a beauty of Indian culture, that it has never believed in imposing one's view on someone else. It was always open for a dialogue and started thinking about that what are the other feelings, what are the other discourses, what are the other issues can emerge out of it, and people were open to embrace it. People were open to accept it, people were open to listen to that. So, the kind of a culture which started in Europe or the West in couple of centuries before, that kind of a culture existed in India since the country was shaped, or since the very idea of India was shaped, right. So, that is a one point why I am making about this. The point I am talking about this, that even the discourse of disability is very, very diverse. Let me give an example and then you will understand. Right. So, there are many Hindi words for disability in a different language. Let us say for example, as you all know, Assam has a different language, Kashmir has a different language, Odisha has a different language, Bengal has a different language, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Kerala, they all have a different language. Right. Obviously, we have a composite culture, but the point is this, that they all are different from each other. And for the word disability, if you translate it in different languages, you will see that there are different words for that. There is not such simple one word that you will see that. Nuances start here, that they all mean different, right. Just try yourself. I am not going to give you example of a different languages, because officially we have accepted 22 languages, right. In India, officially official language is 22 official languages are accepted, but there are more languages and more dialects. So, the point is that if you look at any particular country and if you see that particular word and if you try to translate it, you will interestingly realize that every word translated in their own culture is going to speak something about difference. So, do not you think it is going to be unjust if we use the word disability, which means something different than in our culture, where if you translate the word disability, it has something else, right. That is why I have been talking about the politics of homogenization and hegemonization, because that kind of a politics pervade everywhere, where the English as a language has dominated most of the countries and it tries to challenge other interpretation and does not let other interpretation come out. Obviously, because of the translation studies that is now happening, but still I see that most of the languages are highly influenced. In fact, one of my book that I wrote in Hindi called Uttar Satya was translated as a post-truth. I also talked in there that how even Hindi language is highly colonized, highly influenced by the colonization, right. And which means to say that even the meaning that we are getting is not what it meant in its culture, but rather it is highly influenced by the West. Do not you remember what Lord Macaulay said about India, right. I am sure that if you get time, read a minute on education published in 1835, and he meant two things which I want to tell you before I proceed further. The one, he said that the entire European self of a library, right, just one European self of library cannot be compared to the entire work produced in India and Arabic culture, which means to say that if you see the one European self, right, a self of a library from Europe is going to be much more enriched, highly influential, have a huge amount of knowledge than what entire Arab countries or Indian countries are producing. So, this is an extremely biased views, where he just intended to impose English culture on Arabic and Indian culture, and obviously he could succeed to a lot of extent. And second point, he said that we want Indians in blood and color, but English in taste, morality and intellect, right, which means to say that people will remain Indian in terms of the the country which they belong to, and obviously color, they will look like Indian, but their thinking, their way of thinking of on something, their way of morality, even morality, which is one of the important discourse, and intellect is going to be English one, which means to say that their thinking pattern, their intellect pattern, their morality will be of the West, right. So, you see that even today what is happening, that is very unfortunate, and that is what the background I wanted to set it up, is that disability studies is also highly influenced from the West, right, because people were talking about disability in India very differently. It was not a very institutionalized discipline. People were accepted, and obviously they had a different way of treatment, people with disabilities. They had a very different kind of a treatment in ancient time or medieval and modern times. But because of the colonization influences, they were extremely got discriminated in their own society, where they were included, accepted, part of the main public space, right. That is a one point. What is the second point? Even most of the people who are doing research, they tend to ignore the very cultural differences of the community which they belong to, and impose or borrow the theories from European countries or American countries and talk about it, right. So, the problem is that when you are imposing someone else understanding on your own people, where the things are not the same or things are very different, because as you know, it is a culture that attach meaning to your bodies. It is a culture that is responsible for attaching or assigning certain meaning to your bodies, right. But what happens, people from the West who have done study on a particular body and they have come to some conclusion, you guys or we guys tend to borrow the same thinking, same ideas, and we think that it is going to be the same on our Indian people. So, that happens the same, unfortunately, with disability as well, right. People started thinking that disability or people with disability have the same experience the way people from the West are having the experience. However, you know that since the first lecture I have been arguing, I have been debating and discussing and making this argument vehemently that everyone's experience is going to be different. In fact, what is accepted in one culture may not be accepted in another culture, or what is going to be the same idea in one community is not going to be the same in another community. But still you see that with the moment you listen to the people everywhere, even if they are doing research on some novels or some dramas or some poetries or some memoir, autobiographies, or let us say for example, they are going to talk about certain communities or folk studies, they all are highly influenced from the West understanding, and they talk as if this is the same reality exists in our India. I am not saying that there is a possibility of same reality existing in India, but I am talking about that why can't we do a proper research rather than thinking or making a conjecture without doing a proper reading or understanding of disability that the way it exists in India, right. Second question I also raised, that most of the time what happens in our academic discipline, what is happening in the West and immediately imported from the West to India and is talking about. Let us say for example, environmental studies or eco-criticism in India, people were extremely conscious about nature, right. People were preserving the nature, they were eco-friendly people. I am sure that if you go back to the history, you can realize that how the trees, plants, gardens had a huge importance in our life. In fact, most of our culture are dependent on nature. If you remove the nature, you cannot perform a lot of culture. I am sure that either you are from Bihar or you are from Northeast, right. You will see the Chhat culture performed in Bihar are almost dependent on nature, right. You need a river, trees and so on and so forth. Even the Bihu culture which is performed in let us say Bengal parts and Assam parts, they are also more dependent on nature. Udupi, like any culture you say which people celebrate with open arms and enjoy it the most, they all are dependent on nature. That is not true if we look at the Western culture. Most of the festivals are more mechanic. I am sorry to say this if you are getting offended, but that is true, which means to say that nature is not very much involved. Look at the Christmas. How do you see when you are celebrating the Christmas or Happy New Year, how does you think that nature is extensively involved into that, right. Even the trees that you plant in your courtyard or in your balcony or in your university campus, they are most mechanic one, not the natural one, right. I am not saying that how they are being translated or how their ideas are evolving, but the point, one thing is quite clear, that the very culture of the India is extremely different and diverse from the West. We cannot think that there is some possibility of sharing the same culture, right, because they are dynamically opposite in terms of language, in terms of people, in terms of regions, in terms of the way people have conceptualized the ideas. In the same way, in India, disability was conceptualized very differently, right. Disability was thought very differently in India than any other places. So, people with disability had access to the spaces, they were very much appreciated, they were loved by people, but unfortunately, slowly and gradually, because of the colonizations or because of the colonialism, as things were getting systematized or so called civilized, right. However, I am extremely against the very term called civilization or how to make someone civilized, this very idea. I am extremely against, because what it does, it does not make you civilized, it makes you more mechanic. So, the most thing that is being appreciated in India is culture, right. We are cultured people, not civilized people, obviously, but now people are paying attention more to being civilized, not more being cultured, right. Obviously, the two terms mean differently, but the point what I am making is this, that the US, UK started talking about disability studies, and in India as well, people started talking and debating about disability studies, right. The problem started happening when you are not going to only talk about disability studies, when you are even borrowing the concept and ideas from the West, right. When you are constantly applying the same understanding, same thinking, the way it has been talked in the West to India, all right. That is a problematic, that is a notion which we need to challenge and question that. Even today, you see that most of the books are written with the experience, with the idea, the way it has been imported from US and UK. Let me give you a term and then you will understand that. For a body, for a simple body that you have, there are more than 10 words exist in India, which talks about different attributes of India, different defining characteristics of a body, right. There is Angam, Vikalangam, right, Sariram, but if you look at the Western terminology or Western words, there are hardly few words available, right, and even those few words are negative in connotation, because if you look at the etymology, disability, right, look at this word, disability, which means to say that dis is always used in English as a prefix which conveys negative meaning, disjuncture, disability, right. So, what is this, that even the very word which talks about disability is a negative, right. However, in India, when they are going to talk about bodies, right, it is not that body discourse is a new one in India. In fact, anyway I will be talking about it. When you go back and see the previous discourses, when you look back, you will realize that there are discourses available that are done on the body. Let me give you an example before I talk about the slides, so that you can understand it in a more better way, right. It will make the idea clear. Don't you think that in our Indian culture, most of us always, when we have to talk about disability, we use the example from the ancient myths, and we say that, hey, look how people with disabilities were treated badly in our country, right. For example, we use the example of Manthara, Sakuni, Dhritarashtra, so on and so forth, just to define, just to talk about that their disability was the one important reason that they were discriminated, alienated, or stigmatized, or portrayed as an evil character in our society, right. That is a one. Second, I will come to that for a second later, but let me make another understanding the way it is being circulated in India. The second is that in India, there is a prevalent notion that if you are born disabled, it is because of your past karma, which means to say that if you have done something evil or past in your past life, if you have done something bad deeds, if you are not moral, you are immoral, or if you are indulged in certain vicious activity, that is a reason for you getting born as a disabled being in present society, because you are being punished. It is a kind of a punishment. To born as a disabled is a kind of a punishment in this society, right. To born as a disabled is a kind of a punishment which you are getting because of your past karma. So, now in this you will be punished. So, therefore, society is not responsible for your disability and you can live the way you are, right. So, because this birth is for repentance, right. This birth is for repentance. So, you are not supposed to expect anything from the society. Society is fair, free and fair to everyone. It's you are, if you are disabled, it's because you done something bad, all right. But we tend to forget that there are many notions prevalent about the same kind of a people or disability, where people are worshipped, treated good, and they have a respect. Let us say, for example, there is a rishi called Ashtavakra. We all know that the person was extremely disabled, but the kind of respect he had, I am pretty sure not even so called able body had in the ancient times. Let me give you another example to make this idea pretty clear. Dhritarashtra was not alienated because of his being blind, even if you see that he was a blind, but he became a king and also respected. And the second notion is also that, why do you think that if a person is a disabled, he cannot be human? Being human means you can have a good morality and bad morality as well, because every human beings, it is not that if you are born bad, if you are born abled, right, so called, if you are born abled, you only have a good character. So, you are only nice person, right, and you cannot be bad. In the same case, when you are born disabled, does not mean that people who are born disabled, they can be only evil, or they are only paying the retribution, right, which means to say being human simply suggests that you can be good or bad as well. You feel pleasure and pain both, right. So, why do we reduce the very idea of a disability that if something is evil there, it is because of the body, right? Think about it. A disabled person can also be a good person. Why do we tend to think that if there is a disabled person, he will be always evil, or if he is a disabled person, he will be always good? Being human simply suggests that you feel jealousy, you have emotions, you respond to certain reactions, you also get irritated, annoyed, and also be pleasant, polite, humble. 8 these characters defines you being a human. But every time what happens when there is something evil shown to disabled people, be reduced as if it was deliberately done. That is not the idea. Think about it, right. Let me give you a third example. The third beautiful example is the father, or let us say for example, parents of Swayam Kumar, right. When in our history I am talking about, in myth, because that is where you come with the idea that people were treated badly, like disabled people were treated badly even in our Indian culture. But I am giving these examples which are highly ignored, are never taken into the consideration deliberately, to show the biasness exists, to show that how the culture of India is more prejudiced and biased, right. So, the third example here we have, look at the parents of Swayam Kumara, when unfortunately killed by Dasrath. So, Dasrath comes to the parents and they feel, and he feels bad because he thought that in this jungle or in this forest, he was there to hunt deers, but unfortunately the arrow, like the parents of Swayam Kumar got hit by the arrows, and when he went over there, he saw and he felt very bad. Obviously, they were blind, but he went and he pleaded before those 2 saints and asking for forgiveness. He was being so apologetic and he was requesting not to punish him with any bane. But obviously, what they did, because they were very sad and like he killed Shravan Kumar unfortunately, like Shravan Kumar got killed because of the arrow. So, he said the way I am going to die for my son, in love of my son, where I am craving for my son, but he was killed by you, you will also be killed by seeing that your son is not with you. So, like you will die in the love of your son as well, the way I am dying. Your son will also leave you, and you will be that will be the reason for your death, the way I am being the reason, like you have done this kind of karma, you have done this kind of activity, and we are going to die for the same, right. Here you see there is a huge respect paid by a King Idrisata for the two blind people. So, here you see that in Indian history and culture, there are examples where it was shown, but there are n number of examples if you do not ignore those examples. If you tend to take those examples into the account, you will realize that people have a paid respect for people with disability. Disabled people were very much part of the society. They were included and promoted in our culture very much. All right. So, this is a one important notion which I wanted to make, so that you can understand that how prejudiced academician we have, or how we are so influenced from the West that we not even able to do the proper study of a certain cultures, so that we can come up with a objective understanding of people with disabilities. So, as I have been talking about, since you come from India, or we come from India, which is a very diverse and dynamic countries, it is almost very difficult to do a justice with disability if we are not going to take all the factors or proper methodology into the account. All right. So, this is a kind of introduction which I build it up, so that when I am moving, like obviously this is an extensive introduction which I elaborated on disability, so that you can relate it when I am going to make a one point after another point. They are extremely significant to make you understand that what slide is going to be, and if something I am missing, you can relate and talk about it. All right. So, let us go to the slide number 1 now. Here you see, so first slide, and the first point is talking about that how disability were often seen through a religious or spiritual lens, with some individual revered as holy due to their disabilities. Right? What does it mean? Like most of the time, as I say, that problem is that disabled people in India has always seen as through the religious lens. Second point, before I explain it further, I am nowhere saying that people with disabilities were always considered a kind of a good human being and accepted in the society. There are certain notions, there are prevalence ideas which talk about that they were discriminated, but what I am also talking about, that we need to look at the culture holistically. There are possibilities, there are a number of examples available where you would see that they are also being part of very much mainstream culture, they are included. So, when I am saying that they were seen as a religious or through the spiritual lens, what I mean to say, if you remember, I explained it to you that in certain culture, even the Greek culture, we saw that disabled people were seen as if they are incarnation of divine being, right. They were being worshipped, they were given a very high status in the society. They were revered, right, due to their disability. As you see that most of our gods are, I am not saying disabled, but they are deformed in some way or the other way. They have 3 hands, 4 hands, 2 hands, many heads. They are very powerful, and someone has a different head, so on and so forth. You see that. So, the very idea of our God is very different the way we have in the West. So, because of this understanding that most of disabled people were always seen from the spiritual and religious lens, and they were thought, they were considered as an incarnation of a divine being, right. And due to that, most of the time they do not become part of the mainstream society, because they are always looked as if someone divine is coming over there, right. So, obviously, that understanding also has a problem, right. That thinking also has a problem, because the moment you attach these kind of a meaning to those bodies which are deformed or disabled, they do not become part of mainstream society. They are not accepted as if they are so called human. They are either less human or more human. Right. So, the problem aligns with both the ideas that when you think about disabled people as less human or more human, they are a human. That is a kind of equation we want to make here, right. That disabled people are nothing but just human. Do not treat them as a more human or less human. That is the kind of advocacy we need to do when we are engaging with disability studies, right. So, that is the kind of a thinking we need to circulate, that being evil or being good, they both are very much characteristics of being human. It has nothing to do with the kind of a body you are born, right. But because of judgment, right, as I always say that people like to judge people so quickly, so often. So, this is a problem that when we judge a person, the moment we see disabled, that okay, he is evil. Like in the last lecture, I was also talking about that how we think about hypersexual or asexual, right. That is a problem. Either we think about more human or less human. So, this kind of a thinking has to be debunked, and that is only possible. You can only do this when you really scrutinize these ideas and discourses. So, our job is to challenge them, our job is to question them, our job is to engage with them and to bring new realities altogether. We see that what kind of discourses are coming, where are they coming from, what are the reasons responsible for them, what kind of study done to make these points. All right. So, these are important ideas that we need to pitch for. All right. Let us go to the slide and look at the second point that I am making. The second point is ancient text like the Vedas and Mahabharata make references to characters with disabilities such as Dhritarashtra, who was blind, and Bhishma, who became paralyzed. So, Vedic literature mentions various medical treatments and intervention for disability, indicating an early awareness of these conditions. See, as I always suggested, obviously I have talked about Mahabharata and Ramayana, so I am not going to talk more about it, but the second point that I am interested to make it that it is not that people with disability do not exist. In fact, I have been talked about it in the previous lectures as well, that it is not that there was no doctors available, there were no patients, but the point was that they were treated as a human, they were not treated as a patient, they were very much part of the society. They were very much actively participating in everyday societies. So, the very idea of institutionalization was not there, like hospitalized system was not there. Okay, these bodies should be excluded from this kind of a healthy society. This very notion was not there, because the moment you institutionalize certain ideas or notion, that become a problematic. That become an important concern, right. So, the point what I am talking about, that even in the Vedic literature you see that, right. In fact, there are many saints who were considered to be known for hospitals or medicines, hospital not in a very rigid sense. But the concern was, right, but the problem was that they were very much part of life, but when slowly and gradually started intervening in everyday life because of the Western influences, now people with disabilities are discriminated because of the body they are born with, right. So, this institutional practices and pattern were missing, that is the point I am making. Institutional practices and pattern were missing, and that is the point that you need to think when I am talking about these important slides, right. So, Vedic literature, if you see that they often mention medical treatments, it is not that there is no medical treatments available, it is not that they are not talking about that people are not dying because of diseases, or people are not suffering from something, or people are not having this. No, there are things being discussed and debated, there are medical treatments available, but the medical institutionalized practices were not there, that is the point. Understand the difference between two. One is a medical treatments and the other one is medical institutionalized practices. These two are dynamically opposite, they both connote very different meaning. So, this is what argument I am making over here, right. So, you have to go and look back the ancient text, when you have to go back and look at the pre-colonial societies, then your job is to analyze and understand that whether they had institutionalized practices or pattern, or it was missing. Because the moment you find this, you will see that there are major changes done in this area. All right. So, that is the second point that I am making in this slide. Look at the third point, right. Look at the slide please. The Mughal Emperor Akbar established policies for the welfare of people with disabilities, including the construction of hospitals and institutions for their care, right. So, some Indian traditions such as yoga and Ayurveda offered alternative methods for managing disabilities, focusing on holistic approaches to health and wellness. So, you see that there was yoga, there is the Ayurveda, but you see that these two are not medical institutionalized practices. These are the kind of things where people come together and they just participate. People come with each other and they are working together. So, yoga, if you see that, you may say that yoga was meant for treating people. No, it is a kind of a precaution where people do yoga so that they do not fall as a diseased person. But you see, this is not done in isolation, right. It is not done in isolation, it is done very much with people around. So, in the same way, you see that there are welfare policies. There were welfare policies available to engage with people with disabilities, but these policies and these welfare schemes were not as if hinted towards certain bodies who are not fit for the societies. The intention was not this, the intention was more intended towards wellness, right. It is by making them feel better. It is not that, oh, there is something wrong with your body, let us do something so that you can be cured. This idea was missing in the previous discourses, right. This idea was not very much prevalent in those kind of discourses. Now, look at what Islamic belief has to say about disability, right. This is what I was talking about. Indian Hindu myths who speak about disability. Now, look at Indian Muslim Islamic belief, what they have to talk about disability. Look at the slide please. In Islamic belief, disability is perceived through a lens of inherent human worth and dignity, as all individuals were seen as a creation of Allah, which means God, regardless of physical or mental abilities. Every person is deemed valuable and deserving of respect. Muslims uphold a duty to care for the weak and disabled, guided by religious traditions and the omnipresence of Allah. Look at this line please, right. Look at this, disability is perceived as a inherent worth, right. Look at this. Look at this, inherent human worth and dignity, right. So, the point what I am talking about is even not only in a Hindu culture, but also Muslim religious text, people with disability were given respect. They were treated as a human. Obviously, one thing I love about our Indian society is that we are more inclusive in a sense that we believe in dependency. We do not believe in the idea of independence. Obviously, this very discourse of independence is coming from the West, and now people are made feel comfortable and high regard if they are feeling independent. But I am very much against this kind of society, against this kind of a culture, because when you need each other, when you need in everyone's life, then only you can remain human, right. There should be a human touch which must not be missing from our society. There should be a human inclusion with each other. There should be like dependency, like you need me, I need you, something, this idea should remain exist. Until and unless this idea exists, this very society will look in a vacuum, which is emptiness will be there. And that is why if you see that is what happening in most of the societies where the idea of independence or independent culture is coming into the mind of a people, right. So, the point what I am talking about, in Islamic culture, Islamic belief argues the same thing, right. They say that we need to take care of them, we need to talk to them, we need to help them, but does not mean helping something making them feel discriminated or making them feel realize that how you are born as a disabled, why you are living in this particular society. Islamic belief is very much dead against it, because everyone is creation of a God. Look at this idea, how holistic understanding of human body it can be. When you say that every creation, right, every creature is a creation of a God, which means to say that God has treated everyone equally. No one is superior, no one is inferior. Every body is equal to everybody, whether it deviates from the norm, it does not deviate from the norm, or so on and so forth, whatever you think about it. Right. So, naturally, or if you see the religious text, it is giving a different idea altogether about people with disabilities, which we tend to ignore and fail, are not ready to realize and accept this. All right. Now, let us go back to the second slide, and then I will make another point. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, exemplified this compassionate approach by interacting with individuals with disabilities with kindness and respect. His action serve as a model for Muslim, emphasizing the importance of treating all members of society with dignity and empathy, right. So, how are we getting influenced? We look at our ancestors, and the way we see that our ancestors were living, that is how we want to also live with, right. So, when we look at our role model, and if he or she is doing something, we tend to think that okay, if he or she can do, why not we? So, we tend to realize the legitimation from someone's action, right. So, if suppose you see in your family that some elder is doing something noble task, so you also do it, and even if he is doing something evil, you see the legitimacy from there, and you do this by saying that he is also doing same. So, why not me? And that is why in Indian society, it is huge responsibility of the elder people to be kind and full of human emotions, show that the coming generations can follow the same pattern. So, in Islamic you see that it was shown that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that how he treated disabled people with full of kindness and empathy. So, obviously, in Muslim culture there is a, like Prophet Muhammad is all in all kind of, and people tend to follow a lot of ideas, principles what he has advocated. So, here you see that in Muslim culture also there are respect for people with disabilities, right. There is a people who think that treating disabled people with respect and dignity, with kindness and empathy is a kind of a nice and good task. And I always say, had religion been not there, there would have not been any human morality. What I mean to say, that it is religion that saves us, because there is no religion on this earth which teaches us that violence is a good thing. There is no religion on this earth that teaches that people or certain set of people should be discriminated, right. So, this point we have to borrow and understand this, right. Now, this is what we talked about. One, I major talk about the Hindu religion of India. I also discuss about the Muslim religion. Now, let me talk about the Christian religion and look at what Christian religion has to say in terms of people with disabilities. All right. So, look at your slide please. In the Old Testament of the Bible, disability were often perceived as a punishment from God, is suggested by Kaur and Arora. However, in the New Testament, right, because this was rejected by most of the Christians, Old Testament of the Bible, the New Testament, the teaching of Jesus present a different perspective. Jesus frequently interacted with people with disabilities, demonstrating compassion and inclusion. You see here, when Prophet Muhammad is also treating member of society with dignity and empathy, and here Jesus is treating with compassion and inclusion. So, these actions have influenced the Christian view of disability, seeing it as an opportunity for compassion, inclusion and service to others. As noted by Hazira Sahnaz. So, Christians believe that every person, regardless of their physical or mental abilities, is created in the image of a God and therefore deserves love, respect and dignity. So, here you see interestingly what I have been talking about, all these three important religions. There are many more religions, but obviously I cannot cover all the like Jain, Buddhism, so on and so forth. But you see these three religions all talking about love, respect, compassion, empathy, and that is what makes us human. All right. So, let us go to the next slide. The British colonial administrator introduced Western medical practices. See, that is where the problem started now, which included the establishment of hospitals and asylums for people with disabilities, right. So, disability was often stigmatized during this period with little emphasis on social inclusion or support for those with disabilities. So, here you see, because of the colonization, the culture is getting changed, things are not the way it was. So, Indian constitution adopted in 1950s included provision for the rights and welfare of people with disabilities. The Person with Disabilities, which means to say equal opportunities, protection of rights and full participation act, was enacted in 1995. Remember this time, note this act, and I would say that if you get time, please read this act and you see the transformation and evaluation, right. How in religions people with disabilities were understood, how colonization affected. Obviously, if I talk about each transition, I have to speak for again another 3 to 4 hours, because 1 hour for each transitions, right. But I am giving you this sense so that you can take these key points and read by your own self. All right. So, look at the slide please. 1995 Act safeguard the right of people with disabilities and promote their integration into society. So, various government schemes and initiatives have been launched to provide education, employment and accessibility for people with disabilities. So, despite legal protection and initiatives, right, many people with disabilities still face social stigma, discrimination, barrier to access education, employment and public access. See, that is why I sometimes say, and people tend to judge me, that more than law, religion can save the humanity, right. So, you see that despite there are law in place, people with disabilities are being discriminated, they are not getting love, respect and dignity. However, if you follow the religious principle which people tend to follow, and if it is properly doctrined in human societies or in children or in people, so they will, because they respect God, they respect Prophet Muhammad, they respect Jesus, then they will think that okay, let us do something good, because our ancestors, our respected revered people also did the same, right. So, this is what the proposition I make. Look at the next slide please. So, non-government organization and advocacy group play a crucial role in promoting awareness, empowerment and rights for people with disabilities. So, according to the data 2001, obviously I have talked about it in the previous lecture as well, but I just wanted to show you that what kind of understanding, the kind of projection and the population, the way it indicates proceeded further. But the point is here, right. These are the basically nothing but statistics, I have already covered it. But however, if you want to read more, you can Google or you can go for those policies or census, you can look at it, right. I already have given the details, so you can relate it. So, research on disability including vision, hearing, speech impairments, mental and physical health issues underscore that while these impairments are universal, the experience of disability highly influenced by the health and social beliefs ingrained in one's culture. So, different societies around the globe held varied perspective on disability, each offering explanation for its outcomes, right, for occurrence and prescribing roles and responsibilities for people with disabilities. This explanation reflect the diverse status attributed to people with disabilities. So, cultural interpretation of disability span various realms, right. This is from divine displeasure, where like I was talking about that people think that it is a result of a past karma, right. A divine displeasure basically means punishment, and witchcraft to theory of evil spirit, reincarnation and biology, right. So, see this is this, there are many cultural interpretation. It depends what kind of a culture you are looking at. You maybe look at the divine displeasure, you can look at it evil spirit, you can look at it reincarnation, or maybe sometime body is responsible. Look at the next point, the perception and status of disability are further shaped by factors such as class, gender, family dynamics, economic conditions, educational opportunities and regional or national development levels, right. So, this is one is talking about how there are different way of interpreting bodies culturally, like divine displeasure, incarnation, biologies, all this evil spirits. So, it depends, like when you are looking at certain myths, when you are looking at certain ideas, see how culturally interpreted, what are the meaning is trying to talk about, why is it so, ask questions. Until and unless you ask questions, you won't be able to reach to the idea, right. And then obviously later on question the kind of interpretations, if it is a negative one, because you can, it's time to produce a counter narrative to these kind of narratives, right. And then look at it, what are the national political developments are done in this field, which are extremely helpful to talk about an inclusive societies, right. So, these are the things which are helpful for us, these are things which are important to negotiate and navigate within these discourses, right. So, look at the what are the factors also responsible to make someone disabled, maybe class, maybe gender, or maybe economic conditions, because I have already talked about the idea of a poverty, that how poverty become one of the responsible factor to talk about disability, right. Why is it so that most of the people who are seen disabled are suffering from poverty? Maybe social system, social dynamics, economic dynamics, or something else. So, these are the questions with which I would end this lecture here, all right. But as I suggest that please keep engaging and reading along with these texts which I suggest, and as I have already told you, these cultural interpretation are extremely difficult and nuanced. So, therefore, our job is to look at the critical methodology to interpret and talk about it, all right. So, I am going to talk about disability movements in India in the next lecture, which connects what I have been talking about in this lecture. With that, I would take a break. See you next time. Thank you so much. Take care. Have a nice time. Bye bye.